In the early hours of May the 10th, 1940, one of the most swift and destructive military offensives in recent history occurred in Europe. At the same time, Nazi Germany invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. They had a clear objective: breach France's northern borders and bring down the Western Front within a few weeks. They used a brand new, horrifying tactic called Blitzkrieg, or the Lightning War. It prioritized speed, coordination, and psychological shock over plodding, trench-based fighting. Tanks and low-flying bombers advanced quickly together. Communication lines were disrupted and troops evaded fortifications. The Maginot Line was a system of concrete fortifications that the French had trusted. However, Germany avoided it by passing through the Ardennes forest, a location believed to be inaccessible to tanks. However, the tanks went by and hit the rear hard. Deployed to aid France, the British Expeditionary Force started to withdraw north. In desperation, not strategy. It took 10 days for Belgium to fall. France was engulfed in panic. The German forces moved like butter being sliced by a knife. Shortly after, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were driven toward the shore, facing away from the ocean. One northern French city became the center of a severe situation in the last week of May 1940. Dunkirk. It evolved from a harbor town to the final vestige of hope, a limited time frame for survival. Tens of thousands of French soldiers and the British Expeditionary Force were now completely surrounded. Artillery from the south, German panzers pushing from the east, and the sky was filled with the Luftwaffe's unrelenting roar. The harbour had been destroyed by bombing. There was no use for the quays. Troops were compelled to enter the open beaches, exposed, at risk, horrified. No trenches were present, no cover. There were only men huddled behind sand dunes, wrapped in blankets, looking up and waiting. Their numbers decreased with each air raid. A few were injured. Some people are praying. Some people are trembling and walking directly into the water without boots. They declared, "We wait for the ships." What ships, though? Panic in London. Desperation in Paris. Almost 400,000 soldiers are stranded. The British Army would vanish if they could not be saved. And Britain's fate could be decided. A solemn war cabinet sat in silence at 10 Downing Street. Outside, drizzle soaked the skies of London. History was waiting to be written inside. It had only been 2 weeks since Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. However, he now bore the burden of the country. The army was lost, according to certain military leaders. It is impossible to evacuate. The skies are not under our control. The beaches are deceptive. Churchill, however, refused to accept that. Calm, resolute, and utterly uncompromising. He looked at the map. Just a tiny portion of the French coast is Dunkirk. However, it symbolized Britain's whole future to him. "This is not just a retreat," he said, standing in front of the cabinet, his words echoing into folklore. "Perhaps it is a miracle." Orders went out right away. They called all the warships that could get across the channel. However, it was insufficient. Such a large-scale rescue would be impossible for the Royal Navy to execute alone. Then the thought struck. An almost crazy, desperate solution. Civilian ships, boats for fishing, private boats, barges on rivers. Hundreds of tiny vessels prepared to navigate a conflict area. Operation Dynamo would be the name given to it. And that night, hope made a comeback to the British coast. May 26, 1940. A red telephone rang inside the Royal Navy Command Station in Dover at exactly 7 o'clock p.m. "Dynamo begins" was the only thing said by the voice on the line. One of the most audacious operations in military history began at that time. It's not a territorial conflict. However, saving an army is a race against time. Operation Dynamo was more than just a strategic move. When it appeared that defeat was certain, it was a declaration of human resolve. The simplicity of the plan was bold. As the enemy came in and bombs filled the skies, evacuate the more than 300,000 French and British soldiers who were stranded at Dunkirk. The destroyers, transporters, and trawlers that the Royal Navy possessed were used. However, they were aware that it would not suffice. Thus, Britain summoned its citizens. Anything that might float, including lifeboats, ferries, yachts, and fishing boats. All owners of civilian ships were urged to, "Your boats are needed." Hundreds answered. Naval officials manned some of the commandeered ships. However, many were sailed by regular men, a youthful fisherman, an elderly seafarer, a man with a tiny yacht and a family. They go into danger to bring their guys home, not for fame. The Luftwaffe launched an unrelenting aerial assault. German U-boats waited from the sea. Nevertheless, they set sail. The start of Operation Dynamo. Tens of thousands of soldiers waited on the beaches of Dunkirk. "I'm hungry, weary, I'm scared." However, clinging to a glimmer of optimism, German warplanes circled like vultures overhead. The sea before them appeared just as lethal. The shallow beach was inaccessible to the big naval vessels. In order to be rescued, troops had to form frantic lines and wade into the sea. Then they noticed it. There's a tiny boat approaching, then another, and yet another. A flotilla of little ships battling through gunfire and waves. They were referred to as the little ships. The call had been answered by some 800 small civilian vessels, including private yachts, fishing boats, and ferries. The majority were unarmed. They lacked escorts and armor. However, they had a goal: to return home with their boys. Retired sailors flew some of them, others by teens who are seldom in school. A grandfather and his grandson went sailing. To locate her brother, a young woman took her boat. The operation was more than just a military one. It was a brave national act. These vessels transported soldiers to bigger ships from the beaches. A few were bombed, a few were sunk. However, many came back, time and time again. In one day, one boat made 10 journeys. Only 15 men were saved by another. But each journey was significant. Each life rescued was a triumph. The little ships emerged as the silent, timeless heroes of the evacuation of Dunkirk. Dunkirk was more than just a retreat because of this. It was a time when common people achieved great feats. The sky was a continual danger, even if the water provided an opportunity for escape. The air over Dunkirk was controlled by German Luftwaffe aircraft. Their bombers flew low, hitting everything in their path, even the tiny civilian boats, the Navy ships, and the soldiers on the shore. The channel turned into a trap. It was raining bombs. Fires spread. It was risky every second out in the open. Then suddenly another sound broke through the confusion. British Spitfire's characteristic roar. It was the Royal Air Force. The RAF pilots who flew over Dunkirk were few in number, but strong in their determination. Across the clouds, dogfights broke out. Spitfires and Messerschmitts engaged in lethal dueling. It was a fight for life, not land. When an enemy plane was shot down, hundreds of men below were spared. The RAF pilots used all of their fuel. Some had to ditch in the ocean. Others were struck, falling into an unknown future. Many of them never came back. Their names vanished into folklore, and their planes vanished into the clouds. Nevertheless, everything changed when they were there. Soldiers no longer crouched in terror when they heard Spitfires overhead. Instead, they looked up and applauded. The RAF served as Dunkirk's imperceptible barrier. Additionally, the evacuation might not have been successful without them. Back home in Britain, the country held its breath as men fought for their lives on the beaches of Dunkirk. No television was present, no social media. However, the news quickly circulated that "Our boys are trapped at Dunkirk." Grim headlines appeared in newspapers. Troops surrounded. Germans approaching the shore. The evacuation is at risk. Then the phone rang. The government requested assistance from its citizens. Not cash, not food. Boats were requested. Overwhelmed was the Royal Navy. They then looked to the populace, owners of pleasure yachts, fishermen, and ferry drivers. Anybody who owns a seaworthy boat. Rowboats, steamboats, and riverboats. The instruction in coastal communities was straightforward. Take your boat to Dunkirk if you have one. A few paused. However, the majority stepped up. A fisherman in his 40s brought his adolescent son. An engine that hadn't worked in years was reignited by a 70-year-old retiree. Beside beaten fishing boats sailed luxury ships. They traveled over the channel together, heading for a combat zone. They lacked training. They had no weapons. They were courageous, nevertheless. They became legends together. This mission was more than just military. It was a tale of people, both common and exceptional, coming together to rise. And the soldiers who were stuck in Dunkirk realized they had not been forgotten when they saw those small boats approaching. At Dunkirk, it felt as though time had stopped. Every second mattered. A life was at stake every minute. Commanders rushed to modify the evacuation plans while men waited on the beaches. Bombings continued unabated. They targeted ships. Small boats sailed across the strait, dodging blasts. Each voyage was an act of courage. Every crossing is a death-defying bet. Hundreds could be at risk from a single error or attack. Naval officers and civilian captains put in endless hours of work. Plans changed all the time. The weather was harsh and the waves choppy. Fuel became scarcer. But there was no surrender. A few men were transported by some boats, while others returned completely loaded. In one day, more than 40,000 men were evacuated. However, the numbers were never sufficient. With every update, folks back in Britain prayed, because each soldier who was saved gave optimism that the war would go on. One of the most spectacular events in history was this race against time. At last, the miracle occurred. June 4th, 1940. Officially, Operation Dynamo ended. Despite constant air and sea attacks, almost 338,000 men had been evacuated. However, these figures were more than just data. Every man coming home was a hero. The war was far from over, but the exodus was over. After returning from Dunkirk, the troops readied themselves to protect Britain once more. This incident came to represent the bravery and tenacity of the British people. Dunkirk was memorably characterized by Churchill as the biggest evacuation ever. Despite being a military retreat, the British spirit triumphed. The evacuation was a moral win, even though it was a tactical withdrawal. The miracle of Dunkirk was talked about all over the world. The stories of the stranded soldiers were told in books and movies. The British people and their allies were most significantly influenced by it. because even in its darkest moment, a nation can rise. Dunkirk is more than just a location. It's a sign, a tribute to humanity, optimism, and solidarity. One of the pivotal moments of World War II was the evacuation of Dunkirk. The battle in Europe continued, despite the fact that most soldiers were spared. Germany quickly took over most of Western Europe, including France. It left Britain on its own. However, the Dunkirk events boosted British resilience and morale. It developed into a crucial source of power that would change how the battle played out. More than anything else, Dunkirk represented the solidarity and joint effort of the Allies and their citizens. Britain came up with new plans after Dunkirk. Civilian resolve grew greater than ever, naval troops were bolstered, and aircraft production expanded. The event served as a national rallying cry in addition to being a military lesson. Historians saw Dunkirk as a triumph of the human spirit as well as a military event. The memory of Dunkirk endures today as a striking representation of bravery, selflessness, and optimism.